And I've been invited to here today to sort of take you on a whistle-stop tour of the routes available to Ukrainian nationals. So I'll share my screen with you now, and we'll make a start. So I kind of refer to these routes as quasi-protection routes. It's my name for them. It's not an official designation. But basically, they fit a pattern of sort of recent government policy to introduce immigration routes for people with protection needs. And often the eligibility criteria don't include a protection element other than, say, nationality. And they don't grant protection status. You don't get refugee status or humanitarian protection. The good thing about them is that you can apply for them from outside the UK, which you can't for refugee status or humanitarian protection. Normally, you have to roll up at the border or apply in country or be resettled to the UK after being recognised as a refugee elsewhere. So, for Ukrainian nationals, there are 3 such schemes, although one hasn't opened yet. There's the Ukraine Family Visa Scheme, which was sort of the first one to open. The Ukraine Sponsorship Scheme, or Homes for Ukraine, which is quite controversial. And the Ukraine Extension Scheme, which opens on the 3rd of May. And rather obligingly, last week, the Home Office published a set of rules for them, which made my job a little bit easier. So we now have some sort of fairly good clarity on what the criteria for all the schemes are. Okay, there's also an unpublished concession for surrogate mothers with intended parents in the UK. But an important feature of these quasi-protection routes is that they are a little bit arbitrary. There will be many people from Ukraine and elsewhere who just will never qualify under these schemes. So firstly, I just wanted to walk you through some requirements that are common to all the schemes. There are some validity requirements. Validity has a particular meaning in the immigration rules. If you can't meet the validity requirements, then you haven't even made an application and they won't consider it usually. However, they are, in this case, they are doing something for people who can't meet the validity requirements, usually people who can't provide their biometrics in an easy and quick way. Okay, so ordinarily, though, you have to provide your biometrics and a passport or other document that establishes your identity and nationality. And some of the other schemes have additional requirements, which we'll come to in good time. But what we're seeing at the moment is people are being allowed to enter without first taking biometrics, partly because of the controversy over waiting times and what have you. So the other thing we now know is the suitability criteria that the Home Office are applying to applications. And they're basically saying they'll refuse people who've previously been excluded or deported. If they've got significant criminal convictions, there's a lot more detail around that, but I'm not going to go into it now. If your presence is not conducive to the public good, if you've been involved in a sham marriage, if you've used deception in your application, or if you might not be admitted to another country at the end of your stay, those are the main reasons for refusing people. And the last could be particularly problematic for stateless people. Then in terms of entry, you have to apply for entry clearance before you come to the UK. And you can be granted either a visa or a letter from the Home Office confirming that you can travel. And that letter is for the people who can't give their biometrics, I believe. And it's basically a workaround for sort of perceived bureaucracy. And if you're successful, then you should be granted permission to stay for a maximum of 3 years. Okay, and you can either be given a sticker in your passport, which is valid for 3 months, and then you come in and you collect your BRP or your British resident permit from a post office, or you get a 6-month entry clearance, or you get a letter authorizing you to come, and when you arrive, they stamp your passport with 6 months entry clearance, and you have to apply again from within the UK. Okay, and just probably you're all aware of this working on the EU settlement scheme, but BRPs will only be valid until the 31st of December because the government are basically revamping the whole system and going over to a digital status. There's currently no clarity on what will happen in 3 years' time when people's leave starts expiring. I imagine that will depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine. And other conditions, in theory, you can access public funds, but just as a warning, there are other eligibility requirements to public funds, which I'm not an expert on. Things like habitual residence tests and things which people might not meet. So again, I'm not expert on that. You can also work and you can study subject to Foreign Office approval for some courses, which is absolutely standard within the immigration rules. It applies to pretty much every category of the rules. So on to the first of the schemes, which is the Ukraine Family Visa Scheme. And this, just in terms of who can apply, firstly, you have to have been ordinarily resident in Ukraine immediately before the 1st of January 2022. And the only exception to that rule is for children born after. Okay. And if you're already in the UK, you must have permission to be here or have had permission immediately before January 22, 2022. And if you're granted as a permission as a visitor after the 18th of March 2022, you're excluded from the scheme, presumably because you should have applied under the scheme and not as a visitor. Okay. So the upshot of that is that most irregular migrants and asylum seekers who are here will not qualify. It's not going to be a route for them to regularize their status unless they've arrived very, very recently. Okay. Actually, irregular migrants will be excluded altogether. Right, so who can sponsor family members? So sponsors must be either British, settled, that means with indefinite leave to remain in the UK, no time limit, or EA nationals with settled or pre-settled status, or refugees. But it's always worth remembering, because we've got such a broad range of family members who can apply, it's always worth remembering, you know, just because somebody can't be a sponsor themselves doesn't mean they haven't got another family member who might be able to sponsor the person who's applying. So, you know, check what other family are in the UK if you're helping somebody. So in terms of what family, it's also worth noting that the Ukraine sponsorship scheme could be an alternative if somebody doesn't fit in one of these groups. So in terms of which family members can apply, I've kind of put it into a table form, and we've got 3 groups: immediate family members, who are partners, minor children, parents of children, and fiancés, and proposed civil partners. Then we've got extended family members, which is an incredibly broad range of people. In immigration terms, immigration rules normally are incredibly restrictive around family migration, but here they're not. So we've got parents of adults, parents of children from former relationships, grandparents, grandchild, siblings, and adult children, all of the sponsor or of the sponsor's partner. And then we've got uncles and aunts, cousins and nieces and nephews, but only of the sponsor. And then we've also got another group, which is the immediate family members of extended family members. So basically, these people can bring with them these immediate family members who are the same people here as here. Right. So, can other nationalities apply? So basically, the upshot is somebody has to be a Ukrainian national. Okay. Other people, other nationalities, or potentially stateless people, or maybe even asylum seekers who are in Ukraine, they could apply as part of a family group which includes an immediate family member in column A. So as long as one of these people is a Ukrainian national, then other people can apply in the same family group. Children need parental consent. So if you've got a child, say, coming to join a grandparent in the UK, and the parents are staying in Ukraine or elsewhere, then you need the parents' consent. Safeguarding, I suppose the main issue with this scheme is that because the relationships are quite distant, some people may never have even met their sponsors. And, may have communicated with them very little. I haven't seen my cousins in probably getting close to 10 years now, some of them. People are potentially applying to join people they barely know. So that's the family visa scheme. We then got the sponsorship scheme. And we got some additional validity requirements here. So you've got to be outside the UK. So it's not a route to regularise your status in the UK. You've got to provide the name of a UK sponsor. So if you don't name anybody, then they won't consider your application. And you've got to be under 18. If you're under 18, you've got to be applying with a parent or to join a parent in the UK. So in terms of who can apply, there are kind of 4 elements to it. There's a sponsorship requirement. So you've got to have a sponsor who's been approved. So the sponsors have to register on a website, and there are some at least minimal checks on them before they're approved. If you're applying as part of a family group, you've all got to have the same sponsor. And if your sponsor's not British, then they must have at least 6 months leave to remain. And I think I forgot to mention here, they've also got to be providing you with accommodation. Then we've got a residence requirement. So you've got to have been ordinarily resident in Ukraine immediately before 1st of January 2022. Again, unless you're a child born after. We've got a nationality requirement. So you've got to be either a Ukrainian national or dependent of a Ukrainian national. And dependents of the Ukrainian national partner, minor children, parents, and fiancés or proposed civil partners. But in the last case, the relationship must have begun before the 1st of January 2022. Okay. And then there's some fairly major safeguarding concerns with this scheme, because it's basically encouraging people to go online and meet strangers and connect with strangers who may be bona fide sponsors under the scheme, or they may be traffickers who are never going to bring you to the UK, but will instead take you somewhere else, or perhaps to the UK, and exploit you. And even if even if your sponsors are bona fide sponsors, there's no guarantee that you will get on with them. There's no guarantee they will be suitable. They may be wholly unprepared to cater to your needs, given the likely trauma that people are going to be suffering from. So the last of the 3 schemes is this Ukrainian extension scheme. Now this is for people who are already here. And this is kind of a welcome addition to the immigration rules. There were some quite ungenerous concessions for people. So for example, people on seasonal work visas could have their seasonal work visa extended till the end of the year. Well, that's great, but then they're stuck still working for the same sponsor. They can't do anything else. So this is going to help them and other groups as well. Problem is it doesn't open until the 3rd of May. So everybody who's already here has got to wait till the 3rd of May to make an application. Potentially they could apply in another route and vary their application if their leave's going to expire. Then we got some additional validity requirements. So you've obviously got to be in the UK, and you must have had permission to be in the UK on the 18th of March 2022, unless you had permission before the 1st of January, which has since expired, or you're a child born after that date. Okay, so again, we're excluding most refugees and irregular migrants. Potentially, there are some recently claimed refugees who might have got continuing leave. Maybe if they were students when they claimed asylum. So by refugees, I mean asylum seekers. I've just realised my error, so I need to go and change that in my notes. Right. In terms of who can apply, you've got to be a Ukrainian national or their dependent partner or child in the UK. And partners and children must already have permission as dependents unless they're born in the UK after the 18th of March. And if you're a child born in the UK, you need a full UK birth certificate. And if you're a child applying without your parents, you need parental consent, and there must be suitable arrangements for your care. So quite simple requirements. Now, just to let you know, there is this probably fairly small category of people, Ukrainian surrogate mothers with intended parents in the UK. And this is something I didn't realise until I saw an article about it in Free Movement. But there's a quirk of the law in Ukraine that means that surrogate mothers don't have to be named on the child's birth certificate. The intended parents can be named as the parents on the child's birth certificate, which is different from most of the rest of Europe, different from the UK, notably. And the consequence of that is that children born in Ukraine to British intended parents will be British. Okay, which means that there's something of a it's become very common for people to seek surrogate mothers in Ukraine, and there are about 2,000 children a year born through surrogacy in Ukraine. Not all to British intended parents, other nationalities as well. So basically, there has been a letter from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, which says that people in this situation will be granted, will be considered favourably and will be granted 3 years leave to remain, as in line with the other schemes, I think. And if for some reason the child should be born outside of Ukraine and therefore not British, the child can be given a visa as well, potentially. So that's kind of all the sort of bespoke routes available for Ukrainian nationals. Obviously, the usual immigration routes are also available, but probably not always going to be very more useful than these schemes. So people can still claim asylum and still apply as students and workers and stuff like that, but they probably won't want to. There are some groups that are unprotected. So groups in the Ukraine, obviously asylum seekers, unless they've arrived very recently, can't qualify under any of these schemes. And they probably need to be seeking advice on how to progress their claim in light of the war, because obviously now, whereas previously I think about 15% of Ukrainian asylum seekers were granted status in the UK, now pretty much everybody should qualify for some form of status or not, even if it's only humanitarian protection. So there's an obvious advantage to them pressing their claims now while the situation is such that they would likely qualify. And potentially they could do that through their MPs. But always best to seek advice from a regulated immigration advisor first. Irregular migrants, unless they've arrived very recently, they do have the option of claiming asylum. So that's probably the main thing they can do. And then other migrants, before the extension scheme opens on the 3rd of May, we'll probably have to make use of the various immigration concessions. There are concessions around switching and what have you. Then we got some unprotected groups outside the UK. So stateless persons, that's a very large group of people in Ukraine because of the essentially what happened when Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union. There's a large number of people that had old Soviet passports and never got their Ukrainian citizenship, that kind of thing. Then there were also, I think, about 30,000 refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine. And we've also got people fleeing Russia and Belarus. There were a lot of Russians and Belarusians residents in Ukraine, presumably some as asylum seekers, others as dissidents in other categories, many of which will be fairly horrified by what's going on. Other migrants displaced from Ukraine, although many of those will have the option of returning to their country of origin. And there's also a lot of Ukrainian nationals in Russia who could potentially be excluded because they won't have been resident in Ukraine immediately before the 1st of January. Some of these people might qualify as family members of a Ukrainian applicant, but some people might have difficulty meeting the rules, particularly stateless people and asylum seekers, if they can't produce, satisfactory ID, or if there are concerns about whether they can be readmitted to Ukraine at the end of their 3 years stay.